In this video, I'm going to give a very short and very broad overview of the three-act story structure, which is something we'll be working with for the rest of the semester, really. So, the three-act structure. So, popular movies, popular theater, popular books, and comic books, they rely on this three-act structure. And as I talk about it, if you think back of movies you've seen or graphic novels you've read or books you've read, you'll see that this three-act structure really is part of our culture and the way we tell stories. So there's a setup, an inciting incident, in Act One. Act Two is most of the story where there's a confrontation, and I'll talk about what that is in a minute. And then there's the resolution. That's in general what we're talking about. Um, Setup. There's a situation. The protagonists, the characters have to go through something, and then there's a resolution. And this applies to, comedies, romances, action stories, science fiction, whatever. So, for example, like well, let's go to the next thing here. Here's a graph of how this thing would go. Act One, there's an introduction, setup, confrontation is really 90% of the story, really. And that's when the characters are going through various actions or trying to solve various problems, whatever. But the action keeps rising and rising, and the stakes get higher. Then in Act 3, that's when the climax is, and then there's the falling action or resolution. And so, I'll talk about a couple things here, like the original Star Wars movie, which was made in the late 1970s. That one was with Luke Skywalker, with the first one, right? So Act One, we're aware right away that the galaxy is ruled by this evil empire. That's the first that we see, that there's the massive Darth Vader's massive ship. Is the first thing we see. So we know that there's these bad guys, or this fascist government ruling the galaxy, and we meet Luke Skywalker and the main characters. Then Luke goes off with Obi-Wan and Han Solo. That's Act Two. That's the beginning of Act Two, and then that's the huge bulk of the movie is Act Two, where the characters are facing these challenges and overcoming stuff, and they're sometimes they lose, and there's whatever, but the stakes get higher and higher and higher until finally Act 3, the crisis point, the climax, is when the Death Star blows up. All right, so the Death Star blows up, and then there's the falling action, the resolution. Everybody's happy. We see the good guys all together, and everybody's smiling and happy. So that's a typical three-act structure that stories will follow, especially in popular fiction. Now, it's not just action films. Like when you see the words "rising action," that doesn't mean just action films. It's dramas, romances, comedies, and so on. For example, like a romantic comedy. Act One, we meet the characters. Typically, the two characters. The entire audience knows that they're going to fall in love, right? But the two characters have some contention. They're not getting along for some reason. They're attracted to each other, but something happens. Well, that's Act Two. Is they get together, and then they break up, and then they get together again. There's some then there's a misunderstanding, and they have to break up again, and there's laughter, there's tears, etc., etc., etc. And then the climax is when, in Act 3, is when these two people finally realize and decide, oh, we should be together, and we love each other. And there's typically this big kiss, and the music swells, and then they live happily ever after. I mean, that's one way the arc goes. And those are, the two examples I just gave are, like typical Hollywood kind of things. But but all really, most fiction, great novels, whatever, and the very respected plays like Shakespeare plays, for example, all of Shakespeare's plays follow this structure. And if there's any English teachers in the audience, yeah, I know he had 5 acts, but I mean the arc of the action of the stories he told followed this 3 act structure. So anyway, so Act One, you have a setup and an inciting incident usually. So it's something that introduces the readers to the situation. Like we get an idea of like what the world is that these characters inhabit, what situation they are in, and we're introduced to some conflict that's going to move the story forward. That's a big deal. And Act One also has to have a hook. It has to like draw the viewer or reader in. We have to have a reason for wanting to like either watch the movie or read the book. Whether it's compelling characters or like a really interesting situation. And there's also, like I said, this inciting incident. Usually, like it's something that provokes a change in the character's routine. That's a big deal. Again, it doesn't have to be like inciting incident. It doesn't have to be like, oh, I don't know, a war starts or aliens invade Earth, in which that's aliens invading Earth. That's a good inciting incident, but it doesn't have to be that dramatic. The inciting incident could be that the character meets someone else who's going to be significant in his or her life. It's just like like it could be like the beginning of a romance. But we don't know. It's just like that's the inciting incident which propels the story forward. Okay, this is in this example using a comic book, and this PowerPoint is on Blackboard, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. But like if you take the time to look at this PowerPoint, you can read the panels on the far right. It's it explains. We're introduced to the characters, and it explains that there was this huge disaster, and the characters are all talking. They know the villain who created all this destruction, so they're just talking. This is horrible. We're going to go after this villain. So there you go. That's the hook. That's the inciting incident. And now the confrontation, Act Two. This is the conflict that drives the story, and what's an important point is usually the story, the up and down conflicts, the gives and takes and backs and forths, that is usually driving the story more than the characters, which is an interesting thing to think of. Characters, by nature, as you tell a story, the nature of storytelling is usually character driven. Like the characters are going to behave a certain way depending on, the fabric of their being, right? But Act Two, it's really about the action. And again, I'm repeating myself here, but when I say action, this is not restricted to just action films or comic books. Action is, like like a book like Little Women. The action is the dialogue between these characters and how these characters are evolving. That's what I mean by action. It's not like, ray gun shooting and people jumping off buildings or anything like that. It's the narrative of the story. Okay, so for example, in comic books, a lot of popular movies, it's usually the hero has a conflict to overcome. Okay, that's a typical thing. Now, again, hero has a conflict to overcome that can mean a lot of things, including, you know, it could be something like a character has an addiction that he has to overcome. A character is in love with somebody, and he or she has to convince that other person uh, that that romance is a good idea or whatever. Now, finally, Act Three, like I said, but Act Two, by the way, that's the longest part of the story, right? Then Act Three is the resolution, and followed by the what's called a denouement, which is French, and I think it means something has something to do with the word untying. Um, but this is where the final confrontation. This is the now like this is a little bit confusing because Act Two is where all the action is happening, and then Act Three is the resolution. So you think, well, okay, all the stuff happens in Act Two, and then Act Three is kind of like this quiet time. Well, remember the climax of the story happens in Act Three. Um, so that's the final confrontation in Act Three, or the final, you know, big deal. Like the two people finally kiss, yay, and the music swells, whatever. And then there's the denouement, which is the untying, the resolution. And it's usually the shortest in length. Okay. So the hero saves the day and emerges victorious, and all the plot threads are resolved. So about 1/4 of your story is Act One, about 1/2 is Act Two, and about 1/4 is Act Three. But those are just um, rules of thumb, right? And all this information came from a book by Stan Lee called How to Write Comics. So if you have a 22-page comic, about 5 pages is Act 1, about 11 pages is Act 2, and about 6 pages is Act 3, give or take a panel. That's a quote from Stan Lee. Okay, so let me go to another little presentation here. So anyway, you got Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, setup, confrontation, resolution. Act 2 is the big, chunkier story. And remember that the most of the action will be in Act Two, and it can go up and down, back and forth, right? And the big climax is in Act Three, and then there's the falling action. So that is kind of a very, very general and broad overview. But now that you've heard this stuff, just think of some of the movies you've seen, some of the books you've read. And you'll see that this pretty much follows. It's just natural with us the way to tell these stories. Like one example, even when you talk to somebody and you'll say, "Let me tell you about my day," right? Let me tell you about my day. And so like I woke up late, and I was late for the bus. There's your intro. And then I had to run I'm just making this stuff up as I go, folks. But so yeah, so like I had to run to the bus. I had to run to the out the door to get to the bus. So like here comes the bus. I made it, thank goodness. And then I reach in my back pocket. Oh, I forgot my wallet. So that's the climax. That's that little story. I forgot my wallet, and I had to walk back. To my apartment, so it's just a natural way we tell stories. It just follows this arc, it's not like we invented the 3-act arc and then started telling stories, right? This is just a natural way human beings tell stories. Even jokes, and I use this. So like there's two guys duck hunting, right? Okay, and this is a really stupid joke, so prepare not to laugh. Two guys are duck hunting. That's my Act One. That's my setup. Two dudes duck hunting. And then one hunter turns to the other and he says, "We've been here 3 hours. We haven't got one duck. Do you think we're doing anything wrong?" So that's the confrontation. We've been here 3 hours. And he's turning to the other dude, and he says, do you think we're doing anything wrong? And then the climax is the other guy turns to him and says, I don't know. Do you think we're throwing a dog high enough? And then, ha ha ha, that's the resolution. So, thank you for listening. We'll be doing, I want to say I'll be here all week, but no, we'll be, working with this 3x structure, especially through our next project. All right, take care.